Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. In celebration of the remake of Link's Awakening, I thought it would be fun to make this delightfully cute Nintendo Switch cake with a Link's Awakening theme. This cake was pretty easy to make, so let's get into it. I'm starting with a 10 by 15 by 2 inch rectangular shaped cake, but as you know, this isn't quite the shape of a Switch, so I need to do a little bit of work on it. To start, I'm using my serrated knife to cut off the top to level it, so I'm running my knife along the top edge while turning my turntable. I really love this turntable, it's made by Ateco. Okay, there we go. The top of my cake is trimmed off, and I'm going to keep that for later. You always want to save the scraps just in case you need it for later. And then I'm going to tort this cake as well. Same process, just run the knife through the middle while turning it until the knife comes right through. It's pretty easy once you get the hang of it. Since my cake isn't quite the right shape, I'm going to make it work. So I'm first marking where I want to cut away the cake. I'm cutting off just a little less than 2 inches of cake here, and then I go ahead and run my knife through it. I've got my board already covered, and I'm spreading some buttercream frosting on it so that my cake will stick. I get my first layer into place, and then I move that strip of cake that I cut off earlier, and I put it on the side. And I trim it down so that it matches right up with my first cake, and then I stick it on there with some buttercream. To make this cake extra yummy, I'm adding a thin layer of Nutella. My kids love this stuff. I don't want too much, just a thin layer. And then I add my buttercream frosting. This is my Swiss meringue buttercream, and to flavor it, I added a half a cup of Nutella. You can find the recipe for my Swiss meringue in the description box. Next, I'm adding my top layer of cake, and I do the same as before by adding a small strip of cake to the side. Okay, I've got it all stacked, and then I'm adding a layer of buttercream to cover the entire cake. And then I pop it into the refrigerator to chill. Once it's cold, I decided to round out the edges to make it look more like the Switch. And then I add another layer of buttercream, and I work on smoothing it out with my bench scraper. And I scrape right along that top edge and in towards the center to get that sharp edge. I pop it into the refrigerator again, and once it's cold, I smooth it out one more time with a hot spatula, and then I put it back into the refrigerator, and I take a break after that. It's time for the fondant. First, I'm rolling out my red fondant, and I drape it over my rolling pin, and I unroll it onto my cake. Once I have it on the cake, I'm pressing the fondant up against the sides, and I try to get it nice and smooth. I'm guessing that I want the controllers to be about 3 inches wide, so I'm marking it with my ruler, and then I trim away the fondant using my X-Acto knife. And I trim the sides too. And I do the same process for the blue controller. Alright, there are a bunch of buttons on the Switch, so I'm going to show you how I made one of them since they are all so similar. I start with a thick piece of fondant, and I put plastic wrap over it, and then I press a circle cutter into it. This will make the edges round just like a controller button. Okay, so here they all are. Some of them need letters and symbols painted on them, so for the white letters, the paint I'm using is white food color powder mixed with a tiny drop of vodka. The black arrows, which you can barely see, are painted with straight gel color. Next, I'm putting all my buttons into place. And once they are all in the right spot, I go back and attach all the buttons with edible glue. Now that my controllers are all finished, I'm going to cover the center of my cake with green fondant. This will be the grassy looking area. And then I'm cutting away the excess with my X-Acto knife, but when I go through the center, I'm cutting with a wavy edge. And then I pull off all the excess. I repeated the same process for my blue fondant water. Next up is the mountain. So for this, I started with a few small round cakes, and it's pretty easy. You just carve it into a mountain shape. And I do this by slowly and carefully running my knife down the cakes at an angle. Once I have a basic shape, it is ready to be added to the board. I add some ganache to my board to help it stick, and then I begin stacking and filling with chocolate ganache. I also carved out the top for a spot for the egg. I covered in more chocolate ganache, and then I begin adding some smaller hills around the mountain. Once I have everything covered in chocolate ganache, I'm then covering it in a very thin layer of fondant. This does not have to be perfect at all. You actually want it to be wrinkled here. And I'm gently pressing the fondant into my ganache, and then I cut off all that extra. Using my Dresden tool, I'm scratching up the surface on the mountain. I want it to look rocky, so I'm completely scratching it all up here. Next, I'm brushing it with brown food color powder. I love how the dust makes it look dirty and shaded. I probably could have used a couple other shades of brown too, but I think it turned out pretty good. I wanted to add some greenery on top of my mountains, so I'm tearing small pieces of green fondant and I'm randomly attaching those to the hills. The egg is next, and I really love this part because it's a cake pop. So first, I'm melting some white Merkins brand candy melts, and then I make my cake pop filling out of cake scraps and a spoonful of ganache. Just get that all combined until the mixture sticks together. And then I'm rolling it into an egg shape. There we go, it looks beautiful. Next, I dip my lollipop stick into my melted candy melts, and I stick it into my egg. And then I pop that into the refrigerator to chill. Now that it's cold, I'm going to dip it into my melted candy melts. Actually, I didn't want to melt very much of my candy melts because I didn't want to waste, so I really just spooned it over the egg. It's not perfect, but that's okay. Once the chocolate is set up, I'm cutting out some fondant pieces to make my egg look speckled. I attach these speckled pieces with more candy melts. Next, I push the egg down into the mountain. You really want the pop stick to be resting on the board, so you may have to cut it down to the right height. Now that my mountain is finished, I'm moving on to the palm trees. To begin, I'm cutting thin strips of brown fondant. I have a lollipop stick here that I've brushed with edible glue, and then I begin wrapping the strip of fondant around the stick. For the leaves, I'm using fondant with Tylose mixed into it. I randomly cut out palm leaves. I need about 4 or 5 for each tree. And then I cut out small notches around the edges to make it look more leaf-like, and I curved them around my finger and let them dry out on their side on a piece of styrofoam. Once these have had time to dry, I'm adding a small ball of fondant to the top of each tree. I attached it with some melted candy melts, and then I add my leaves, which are also attached with green candy melts. Just hold each leaf in place until it sticks by itself. Okay, now on to Link. Link is made completely out of fondant with Tylose mixed into it. First, I roll out a ball of fondant for his head. I use my finger to press where his eyes and mouth will be. I give him a triangular shaped nose. And then I made 2 triangle ears too. Okay, those are going on, and using a Dresden tool, I'm creating an indentation in each of the ears. The mouth, eyes, and eyebrows are hand painted. Okay, now that I have his face finished, I'm giving him some blonde hair. These are just some yellow pieces of fondant that I modeled into his hair shape. His body is the shape of a teardrop, and I attach that to his head with edible glue. His arms and legs are made from logs of fondant. I laid them spread out like he's passed out. His clothes are made from a small sheet of fondant, and I cut it into a dress-like shape. His belt is a strip of brown fondant, and his belt buckle is made from a tiny log of yellow fondant that I shaped into a square. And next go on his boots. I create his small little hands and fingers and push those into his arms. And lastly, he gets a cute green hat. Okay, onto the water. For this part, I'm using my airbrush and I'm spraying teal color at the top, and then I move on to a darker blue. It looks pretty cool, I think. The sand is graham crackers and brown sugar that I combined in my food processor. I spoon that all over the middle section to make it look like a sandy beach. Okay, going back to the water. I'm creating the white water splashes by piping royal icing right along that edge, and then I also piped a little more in random areas to look like waves. And then I grab one of my brushes and I use it to create brush strokes to mimic a wave. It's like a brush embroidery technique, but I don't want it to be too perfect. I'm going to add my mountain next, but before I can do that, I need to add some plastic straws for supports. I get those cut to the same height as my cake, and then I add some royal icing to help it stick. Okay, there we go. And then I stick my palm trees in. And carefully, I add Link. After I added all these pieces, I felt like it needed just a few more things. The clouds. These are hand modeled out of fondant. They're very easy to make, and actually I ended up redoing these because they were a little too big. But I used the same technique. Once I had it modeled, I dipped the toothpick in some edible glue and then I let it dry. I also need a wooden plank, which is super easy to make too. I cut out a rectangle and I scratched it up to look like wood, and then I dusted it with brown food color dust. Just one more decoration. It needs some green bushes. I formed this shape with my hands and pushed a grass piping tip in it to create the texture. And finally, I dusted it with green food color dust. Alright, let's get these final pieces into place. I think this looks much better, and clouds really finish it off. My Link's Awakening cake is complete. It turned out pretty cute and will be perfect for my game night. Thank you all for watching, and if you have any ideas or suggestions for me, please let me know down in the comment section. Alright, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!